Humans called them special forces. Their brutality made even demons tremble. The Galactic Convergence was the greatest alliance of minds and weapons the known universe had ever seen. 214 species bound together by treaties, shared technology, and the mutual understanding that no single civilization could survive the void alone. For 3,000 years, the Convergence had held against every threat: pirate fleets, rogue AI swarms, and the terrible silence of dead civilizations that had tried to stand by themselves. It was, by every measure, the most powerful governing body in existence. But on the morning that the Cathara came to Terth IV, none of that power seemed to matter at all. The Cathara were not simply warriors. They were nightmares given flesh and bone. 8 feet tall and covered in natural bio-armor that could deflect blaster fire and survive the cold vacuum of open space, they had raised civilizations long before the Convergence was ever born. Their eyes burned a deep and constant red. Their voices were like stone grinding hard against stone, and their culture had no word for surrender, only conquest and death. They came from the void expanse, the dark region beyond the outer rim where no coalition ship had ever returned from. And when they moved against a world, that world simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. But Terth IV was a frontier colony. 30,000 civilians, a small coalition peacekeeping garrison, and nothing else worth naming. When the Cathara war fleet dropped out of dark space and began their descent, the garrison commander managed to send one distress signal before his command post was turned to ash. The warband moved through the colony like fire through dry grass, fast, total, and completely without mercy. Within 4 hours, the garrison was gone. Within 6, the colony's outer districts were rubble. The Coalition Supreme War Council convened within hours of the first signal. Representatives from 47 species crowded into the Great Chamber on Velum Prime, their voices rising over each other in a storm of noise and panic. The Foria ambassador demanded an immediate evacuation of all frontier worlds before the Cathara could press further. And the Sulhari warlord called for a massed naval response and was quickly reminded that every previous massed naval response to a Cathara warband had ended in disaster. The Rethian speaker gently suggested diplomacy and was met with stunned silence from every corner of the room. There was no good answer, and every being in that chamber already knew it. Ambassador Selene Okafor sat at the human delegation's small table near the back of the great chamber and said nothing for a long time. She was a tall woman with dark skin and close-cropped hair, and the kind of absolute calm that made other species deeply uncomfortable when they finally noticed it. She listened to the arguing and the crying and the proposing and counter-proposing without expression, and then she raised one hand and quietly asked for the floor. The chamber settled, more out of curiosity than actual respect. Humanity was new to the Convergence. They had only been members for 11 years. And in that time they had made no great military displays, launched no vast fleets, and conquered no worlds. They were considered, at best, a mid-tier species, emotional, oddly short-lived, and strangely obsessed with their own long history of internal violence. Most Convergence members found them entertaining in a small way, the way one finds a young and loud child entertaining. Selene stood and addressed the council in calm and simple words. For fleet numbers, weapon counts, for fleet numbers, weapon counts, strategic proposals, resource commitments. Selene offered none of those things. She said only that the team would depart within the hour and reach Terth IV within 2 standard days. The Foria ambassador asked, slowly, how large this response force would be. Selene told him, 12 soldiers. The Cathara had destroyed a full garrison. The Cathara had destroyed a full garrison of 800 trained coalition troops in under 4 hours. They had standing warbands numbering in the thousands on the surface below. And the humans were sending 12 individuals, 12, in response. Selene did not flinch. She did not blush or look away or shift her weight, and she waited for the noise to fade the way a person waits for rain to stop, patient and unbothered and completely certain of what was coming next. When the room was quiet again, she said it simply, "We call them special forces." She sat down and folded her hands on the table. On the station's outer observation deck, Zell of the Foria stood alone and watched the small human transport vessel leave its dock and shrink slowly against the stars. Zell was a senior military analyst, 4 arms, a pale blue skin, and a mind built and trained to measure threats with cold and careful precision. He had studied every major conflict in Convergence history. He had written academic papers on Cathara battle psychology. He had never once in his long career lost sleep over a military situation. But something about the way that human ambassador had sat there made him open his datapad and start reading. And he pulled up everything Earth had submitted to the Convergence regarding their military history. Not classified files, just the broad and public record they had offered on entry. He found something described as Special Operations Forces. He found organizations with quiet and almost administrative-sounding names that became deeply unsettling the moment he read the operational records attached to them. The small groups, sometimes as few as 6 or 8 individuals, deployed deep into hostile territory with no fleet support, no retreat plan, and mission objectives that no conventional convergence force would ever be assigned. He read about the selection process these soldiers went through. Years of physical and mental stress designed specifically to eliminate the majority of candidates and forge the rest into something harder. Training across every environment imaginable. Desert, ocean, a mountain, Arctic, dense urban ruin, languages, demolitions, infiltration tactics, close-range combat, survival in conditions that should not sustain a living body. And then, after all of that, they were sent into the worst places in existence and told to do what conventional forces simply could not. Zell read for 2 hours without stopping. He set his datapad down and stared at the dark between the stars for a long while. He thought about Ambassador Okafor sitting in that chamber while a room full of warlords and admirals laughed at her, and how not a single muscle in her face had moved. He thought about 12 soldiers on a dark transport vessel already en route to a world covered in Cathara. He opened a new file and began writing a report for the council. At the top, he wrote 6 words. "We have misjudged the humans completely." He stared at that line for a moment. And then he added one more sentence below it. "I almost feel sorry for the Cathara." He almost believed it. The black transport came out of FTL at the edge of the Terth system without any signal, without any identification code, and without asking permission from anyone. It moved fast and low toward the planet, cutting through the upper atmosphere at an angle that most pilots would have called reckless. The Coalition surveillance station in orbit tracked it with mild alarm before the vessel went dark. No heat signature, no active systems, nothing on any scanner, and simply vanished into the cloud cover below. Inside the transport, 12 humans sat in 2 rows facing each other and said almost nothing. They were not large people by Cathara standards, or even by the standards of several other species in the Convergence. And they were built lean and hard and moved with the kind of quiet that came not from shyness but from long habit. Their gear was dark and fitted close to the body. They carried weapons that looked almost plain next to the energy rifles and plasma cannons that Convergence forces typically favored. But every piece of equipment they carried had been chosen for a reason, and each of them knew exactly how to use everything the others were carrying, as well as their own. And their team leader was Captain Ren Hollis, 34 years old, brown eyes, a scar along his jaw from a mission that was still classified at the highest level. He sat at the front of the row and looked at a terrain map of the colony on a small screen without expression. He had been in environments worse than this one. He had completed missions with fewer people and worse odds. He had never once failed to bring most of his team home, and he did not intend to start today. He turned off the screen when the transport hit the ground in the ash of a burned-out district 12 kilometers from the colony center. The ramp dropped. 12 people walked out into the gray air of Terth IV. The transport lifted again immediately and climbed back through the clouds. They were alone. Now, the Cathara had scouts everywhere, fast-moving packs of 6 to 12 warriors that ranged out from the central war band to secure the surrounding terrain and hunt down any survivors still hiding in the rubble. The Coalition surveillance drones overhead tracked the movement of one such scout pack, 40 warriors moving through a burned industrial zone, as it detected the heat signatures of the newly landed humans and turned toward them. Yet the analysts watching from the station above prepared to document a massacre. What they documented instead would be reviewed and studied and argued about in military circles for the next 100 years. The 12 humans did not run. They did not group together or form a defensive line the way any trained conventional force would have done when outnumbered by more than 3 to 1. They spread apart, wide, deliberate spaces between each person, and they moved into the ruins with a low and purposeful speed that the drone cameras struggled to track. The Cathara pack charged in the way Cathara always charged, loud, fast, and confident, because 40 of them had never in their history failed to overwhelm any ground force they had ever met. They hit the industrial zone in a wedge formation and found nothing. No humans in the open, no defensive line, just broken walls and ash and silence. And then the silence broke. But not from one direction, from 4 directions at once. The humans had split without a single spoken word and flanked the pack from both sides and the rear simultaneously, and they moved through that engagement with a speed and a cold precision that the drone footage would later show was almost impossible to fully follow in real time. There were no wasted shots. There was no hesitation between one action and the next. Each of the 12 moved as though the entire choreography of the fight had been rehearsed 1,000 times before in some dark training facility on the other side of the galaxy. In 3 minutes and 51 seconds, the scout pack of 40 Cathara warriors was gone. 3 minutes, 51 seconds. Not one human was seriously hurt. The surveillance station went completely silent for almost a full minute after the drone feed went still. Then everyone started talking at once. And none of the conversations made much sense because no one had the right words for what they had just seen. Zell of the Foria sat in the analysis room and watched the footage again from the beginning. He slowed it down to half speed and then to quarter speed and watched the way the humans moved. The hand signals so small and fast they were nearly invisible. The spacing between each person that suggested not 12 individual decisions, but one shared and continuous awareness of the entire space around them, the way each soldier seemed to know at every moment exactly where every other soldier was without looking. It was not the technology that bothered Zell. The humans' weapons were good, but not exceptional by convergence standards. It was not even the speed or the physical ability, though both were remarkable. It was the decision-making. Every choice those 12 people made in that engagement was correct. Not lucky. Correct. Correct in the way that only comes from doing something so many thousands of times that the thinking is gone and only the doing remains. Zell pulled up the service records of each individual on the team, the portions that were not sealed behind Earth's military classification system. What he found made his 4 hands feel cold in a way he did not entirely understand. And the youngest member of the team was 26 years old and had already completed 9 covert deployments across 4 different conflict zones. The oldest was 41 and had been in continuous active service for over 2 decades. Several of them had been wounded multiple times, injuries that would have ended the military careers of soldiers from almost any other species, and had returned to active duty within months each time. And every single one of them had more confirmed combat experience than most Convergence Battalion commanders would accumulate in a full career. Zell set down his datapad. He thought about a question that had been sitting at the back of his mind since he first read the human military files, a question that felt important in a way he could not fully explain. What kind of civilization, he thought, produces soldiers like this and then keeps them quiet, keeps them back, keeps them hidden? He sends them out in groups of 12 into the dark and tells no one? He looked at the frozen drone image on his screen, 12 small figures standing in the rubble of the industrial zone, completely still, already moving on to the next task. What kind of species, he thought again, and this time the question had a different weight to it. Chooses to build these people? He did not have a comfortable answer. And somewhere below on the surface of Terth IV. See, 12 humans were already gone, melted back into the ruins, and the Cathara warband at the colony center had just received word that their 40-warrior scout pack had stopped responding. Vron the Undying had lived for 312 years, and in that time he had burned 3 worlds, killed 11 opposing commanders in single combat, and led 17 successful planetary conquests across 6 star systems. He was not merely feared among the Cathara, he was revered. His name was spoken with something close to worship by his own warriors, and with something close to despair by everyone who had ever faced him in the field. He was, by any honest measure, one of the most dangerous living things in the known galaxy. He had not become concerned when the first scout pack stopped reporting. Scout packs encountered unexpected resistance sometimes. Equipment failed. It happened. He had sent a second pack to investigate and thought no more about it. When the second pack also went silent, he became mildly curious. When the third pack, this 160 warriors strong, failed to return by the end of the first night, Vron finally climbed to the top of the ruined colony administration tower that he had made his command post, looked out over the dark and broken cityscape, and allowed himself a single question. What exactly was out there? The answer came in pieces over the next 36 hours, and in each piece was more unsettling than the last. His forward supply cache, a fortified depot carved into the lower levels of a collapsed structure, was destroyed in the early hours of the second morning, not attacked by a large force. Destroyed quietly, precisely, with demolition charges placed at the exact structural points that would cause the most complete collapse. Whoever had done it had known what they were doing. It had moved through an area patrolled by 200 warriors without being detected, and had been gone long before the explosion happened. 3 hours later, a communication relay tower, one of 5 that Vron had established to coordinate his warband across the colony, went dark. When warriors were sent to check it, they found the relay had been dismantled from the inside. Not blown up, taken apart carefully and deliberately, in specific components removed so that it could never simply be repaired. 6 hours after that, a patrol of 30 warriors that had been moving through the Eastern District stopped reporting mid-route. No explosion, no sounds of battle recorded by the other units nearby. They were simply there, and then they were not. Vron stood in his command post with his senior officers and looked at the tactical map on the wall and counted the losses. In 36 hours, and he had lost over 200 warriors, not in a pitched battle, not to a fleet bombardment, not to any force he could point to on a map and direct his warband toward. They were being taken apart piece by piece in the dark, and he did not know where the enemy was at any given moment. This was not how war was supposed to work. Then his warriors brought him the prisoner. She had been caught alone near the southern water processing ruins. A small human female. Then one of the 12 that intelligence had confirmed were operating on the surface. She was not attempting to escape when they found her. She was sitting on a piece of rubble eating something from a small pack, and she looked up at the 6 warriors surrounding her the way a person looks up when a mild inconvenience has arrived. Her name, the human's record said, was Staff Sergeant Dara Vasquez. She was 29 years old. Now, because he was curious now in a way he had, because he was curious now in a way he had not been curious about an enemy in a very long time. He was more than twice her height. He outweighed her by a factor that made comparison almost pointless. He had broken stronger beings than this one with one hand. He looked down at her in the cold light of the command post and waited for fear to appear on her face. It did not appear. She looked back at him with those dark and quiet eyes and said nothing. He ordered his interrogators to begin. The session lasted 2 hours. Vron watched for most of it, not with enjoyment, but with focus, studying the human the way he had once studied a strange new weapon to understand how it worked. She was given every reason to speak. She did not speak. She did not beg. She did not break down or plead or make the sounds of despair that every other prisoner Vron had ever taken eventually made. What she did, and this was the part that stayed with him long after everything else, was watch him, not her interrogators, not the walls or the floor or the empty middle distance that suffering beings usually fix their eyes on. She watched Vron specifically, with an expression that he could not read no matter how long he studied it. And it was not hatred. It was not defiance in the way he understood defiance. It was something quieter and far more patient than either of those things. It looked almost like she was waiting for something, like she already knew something he did not, and she was simply passing the time until the moment when that knowledge would matter. Vron left the room and ordered her to be held in a secured cell in the lower level of the tower and guarded by 8 warriors. He needed to think. He did not get the chance. In the early hours of the 3rd day, the lower level went loud, not the sustained sound of a firefight, but sharp and brief, and then suddenly quiet. When warriors reached the cell, the door was open, 4 guards were down, and Staff Sergeant Dara Vasquez was gone, through 8 guards, alone, injured, in an enemy command post in the middle of a war band. Vron looked at the empty cell for a long time, and he had fought gods and beasts and armies and the cold madness of the void expanse itself. He had been wounded only twice in 3 centuries, and both times he had shrugged it off within a day. He was, by every measurement that the Cathara used to measure such things, beyond the reach of fear, but standing in that empty cell, and looking at the open door and the 4 fallen guards and the small scuff marks on the floor that showed exactly where a single human soldier had moved with terrifying purpose through the dark, Vron felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. The feeling sat with him all morning. On the station above, Zell of the Foria was watching the same event unfold through surveillance data and intercepted Cathara communications, and he recognized exactly what was happening to the most feared warlord in the void expanse. He typed one word into his report log and underlined it. The word was dread. Vron had ordered his forces to consolidate, to pull back from the outer districts and gather at the colony center. It was the first defensive order he had given in 3 centuries of warfare. The Cathara did not know how to process the instruction. It went against everything they were. But they obeyed. Because Vron had told them to, and because somewhere in the ruins around them 12 humans were moving through the dark, and no one could hear them coming. The Cathara temple fortress rose from the ruins of the colony's central district like a monument to the conquest that had already taken place. Vron's warriors had built it fast. Thick outer walls made from the collapsed remains of the colony's largest buildings, reinforced with Cathara field plating, guarded at every angle, and packed with over 3,000 of the most brutal and experienced warriors the void expanse had ever produced. Every entrance was covered, every approach was watched, every shadow between the outer walls and the city ruins beyond was under observation by rotating patrols. By any reasonable military calculation, the fortress was untakeable by a force the size of the one approaching it. Coalition High Command watched from orbit and said almost nothing. But the mood in the station's command center was quiet and heavy. Every analyst there had already done the math. 3,000 Cathara veterans behind prepared defenses was not a problem that 12 soldiers should be walking toward, regardless of what the footage from the previous days had shown. Someone in the back of the room had quietly begun pulling up the proper forms for posthumous military honors, the kind that Earth had submitted paperwork for when they first joined the Convergence, and the forms explaining what their soldiers were owed when they did not come back. Captain Ren Hollis lay flat on the rubble of a collapsed building 300 meters from the fortress outer wall and looked at it through a long-range scope for almost an hour without moving. Beside him, his second-in-command, Lieutenant Yara Ndidi, watched the patrol rotations with a small data counter in her hand, timing the gaps between each pass to the second. And the rest of the team was spread out behind them in the dark, waiting without noise or complaint. Hollis did not find the fortress intimidating. He had assaulted fortified positions before with worse odds than this one, and what he was looking at right now was not a fortress that had been built to repel a force like his. It had been built to repel a conventional military assault. Massed troops, vehicles, aerial bombardment, and a direct frontal approach by a large force that would announce itself by its own size and noise long before it arrived. The walls were high and the guards were many, and the firepower inside was overwhelming. But none of that was useful against something that arrived without noise from a direction that was not being fully watched, at a time that fell in the exact gap between patrol rotations, moving in a way that did not show up on standard heat detection arrays, because every person on the team had spent the past several hours wrapped in terrain cooling material that flattened their thermal profile to near zero. Hollis turned to Ndidi and held up 4 fingers, then pointed in 4 directions. The team split without a word. What happened over the next 4 hours was not a battle in any sense that the Cathara understood battle. There was no clash of large forces in the open, and there was no declaration, no challenge, no moment where the two sides faced each other with their full strength. Instead, the fortress began to come apart from the inside out, quietly at first, and then faster, and then all at once in a way that the 3,000 warriors inside could not orient themselves against because the threat was never in one place long enough to be faced. The Eastern Guard rotation went dark first. 12 warriors vanished between one patrol check and the next. And then the interior communication lines were cut, not from outside, but from a relay point inside the second wall, which meant someone was already inside the second wall, which should have been impossible. Alarm signals conflicted with each other, sensors triggered in places that made no tactical sense, pulling warriors away from their positions to investigate nothing, leaving other positions briefly open in ways that were immediately and quietly exploited. The confusion spread like something infectious. Warriors who had never felt uncertainty in their lives found themselves turning in circles, covering for positions that should not have needed covering, unable to tell where the actual threat was coming from, because the actual threat was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. 3 of the 12 humans were hurt during the assault, 2 with wounds that were serious enough that they should have stopped moving. They did not stop moving. They redistributed their gear, adjusted their roles in the team formation, and kept going as though stopping was simply not a concept that had been included in whatever they had been built from. Zell watched from above and found that he had stopped breathing at some point and had not noticed. And then, the inner sanctum of the fortress, where Vron stood with his senior officers, was breached. The door did not blow inward the way a dramatic entrance should. It simply opened, fast and hard, and Captain Ren Hollis came through it. Vron had been waiting. He had pulled his best guards in close when the chaos in the outer sections began, and he had made a decision. If this human was coming for him, he would meet the human himself. He was Vron the Undying. He had killed generals and warlords and things that the rest of the galaxy did not have names for. One human, one small, unarmored, a plainly equipped human, was not going to end 300 years of conquest. He was twice Hollis's height and covered in natural armor that had stopped blaster rounds. He had speed and mass and centuries of combat experience. He swatted the first attack aside like it was nothing, and it was nothing. A test, a probe, the first word of a conversation that both of them knew would end badly for one of them. The fight lasted 11 minutes. It should not have lasted 2. And by every measure of size and strength and endurance, Vron should have ended it in the first 30 seconds. He almost did. 3 times he landed blows that would have killed most living things, and 3 times Hollis hit the ground and then got back up. Not stumbled upright. Got back up. Deliberately, methodically, with his eyes still on the target and his body already repositioning before he was fully standing. As if falling down was just a step in a process rather than a defeat. As if pain was a note of information to be processed and filed away and dealt with later rather than a reason to stop. Vron bled for the first time in decades. A blade, small, fast, almost invisible in Hollis's grip, had found a gap in the bio-armor under his left arm on the 4th exchange, and the shock of it was less the pain and more the sheer disbelief that it had happened at all. In the end, Vron won. Then he was bigger and stronger and more durable, and he outlasted the human through pure physical dominance. Hollis went down on one knee with a broken arm and a swollen eye nearly shut, and blood on his face, and his breathing was loud and ragged in the silence of the room. Vron stood over him, weapon raised for the final blow, and Hollis tried to get up again, not successfully. His body would not allow it, not quite, not yet, but the intent was there, the muscles were firing. Say the hands were pressing against the floor, and the one eye that was still fully open was looking straight up at Vron without an atom of surrender in it. Vron had never in 300 years stopped to ask an enemy a question during a killing blow. He stopped now. He asked, in the galactic trade tongue, what manner of thing Hollis was. Hollis coughed, and there was a small, exhausted sound that was almost a laugh underneath the cough. And he said one word. So he said, "Tuesday." Vron did not know what that meant. He would later discover it was a reference to a human calendar division, implying that today, this moment, this assault on a fortress of 3,000 with a team of 12 while broken and bleeding on one knee, was simply an ordinary day's work. Behind Hollis, the rest of the team breached the second entrance to the room, Vron the Undying. 3 centuries old, destroyer of worlds. The being that the galaxy had built its nightmares around, looked at the 11 people coming through that door, and then looked down at the one already on the ground still trying to rise. He made a calculation, and then Vron ran. The news moved through the void expanse faster than any ship could carry it. Vron the Undying, the being whose name had been a death sentence for 3 centuries, had fled a battlefield, not retreated in good order. He'd not fallen back to a stronger position as a tactical choice, fled, running from a handful of beings barely a quarter of his own size, leaving his fortress and his warband and everything he had built on Terth IV behind him in the dark. The Cathara war fleet in orbit received the order to withdraw within hours of Vron's escape from the colony. No formal explanation was given. Cathara command culture did not require explanations from those above to those below. But the fleet moved anyway. Back into the void expanse, away from Coalition space, without firing a single additional shot. 3 days later, every Cathara force in every territory they had threatened along the outer rim had pulled back to the expanse border. No one at Convergence High Command had asked them to leave. No fleet action had been taken, no treaty had been signed, no formal demand had been issued. 12 humans had ended the war, and they had done it without anyone in the coalition fully understanding how. The survivors of Terth IV's civilian population began to emerge from the deep shelters where they had been hiding since the first day of the attack. They came out into the ash and the ruins of their colony, blinking in the gray light, and found no Cathara waiting for them. They found 12 humans instead, sitting in the rubble near the center of the ruined colony, several of them being tended by the team medic, all of them looking tired and battered and completely unhurried. A small Foria child, one of the colonists, walked up to Captain Wren Hollis, where he sat with his arm in a field splint and stared at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with his one fully open eye. She asked him, in the trade tongue, if he was all right. He told her he had been worse. She looked at him very seriously for another moment and then went back to her family, apparently satisfied with this answer. The Galactic Convergence Council chamber was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before when Ambassador Selene Okafor gave her debrief 7 days after the liberation of Terth IV. Not the polite quiet of protocol, not the restless quiet of a room waiting to argue, a deep and thoughtful quiet, the quiet of 214 species sitting with something they were still processing and had not yet found the right box to put it in. Selene spoke for 20 minutes. She covered the timeline, the operational sequence, the outcome. She thanked the Council for their patience. She acknowledged the role of the Coalition surveillance assets in monitoring the situation. She was polite and precise, and gave away nothing that was not already visible in the drone footage the whole galaxy had now seen multiple times. When she finished, the chamber stayed quiet for a moment. Then Zell of the Foria raised one of his 4 hands, and he said that he had a question, and he hoped the ambassador would answer it honestly. Selene looked at him and nodded. He asked with great care in his voice, "How many soldiers like those 12 did Earth have?" The chamber leaned in, every representative of every species, every military attaché and diplomatic aide and council observer, all of them leaning slightly forward because this was the question that had been sitting in all of them since the drone footage first played on every screen in the Convergence. Selene was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who did not know the answer, the quiet of someone choosing very precisely how to deliver it. She said, "Enough." The chamber waited. She added with no change in her tone, no drama, or no particular emphasis, "And they are not our best." The quiet that followed that sentence was a completely different kind of quiet from the laughter that had filled the chamber when she first said the words "Special Forces" less than 2 weeks ago. That laughter had been easy and careless. This quiet had weight to it, the weight of 214 civilizations doing arithmetic simultaneously and arriving at conclusions that none of them were entirely ready for. Dexel wrote 6 words in his report that evening. "We have much to learn from them." He thought about adding something more, some analysis or conclusion or reasoned perspective. He had been an analyst for 40 years. He always added something more. He left the 6 words alone. In the void expanse, in a command chamber aboard the flagship of the Cathara fleet, Vron sat in the dark and said nothing. His generals stood before him and did not speak either. It's because they had learned in 3 centuries of service that there were moments when Vron was thinking and moments when he was done thinking, and that interrupting the first kind of moment was the last thing most beings who had tried it ever did. Eventually, one of his younger generals, a warrior named Krethvas, who had not been on Terth IV and therefore did not fully understand what had happened, spoke. He said that the fleet was ready. He said that they could return to Coalition space with 5 times the previous force. He said that the situation was recoverable, that the retreat had been strategic, that the Cathara had never truly been beaten, only momentarily inconvenienced by a handful of strange aliens who had gotten lucky once. The other generals said nothing. They had been on Terth IV. They understood things that Krethvas did not yet understand. Vron looked at Krethvas for a long time without expression, and he asked the young general a question. Had he ever encountered something that kept getting up? Krethvas said yes. Most strong opponents were difficult to put down. Vron shook his head slowly. He said that was not what he meant. He said, Had Krethvas ever encountered something that kept getting up not because it was strong, but because it had simply decided that staying down was not something it was willing to do? Not from power, not from armor or healing ability or superior biology, but from decision, from some internal place that had no name in any language Vron had ever spoken in 300 years of life. Krethvas had no answer for that. Vron told his generals that they would not be returning to Coalition space. He told them that what lived in the dark regions of human territory was not something that could be resolved with 5 times the previous force or 50 times. And he told them that he had looked into the eye of something on Terth IV, one ordinary human, broken and bleeding and unable to stand, still trying to stand anyway. And that whatever lived inside that thing had no bottom to it that he had been able to find. The room was silent. Vron said, very quietly, the words that his generals would repeat to their own generals and their own children for generations to come. We do not go back. We do not go to the world of humans. Not ever. No one argued. On Earth, at a fog-covered mountain base that did not appear on any public map and had no official name in any document that civilians could access, 12 soldiers sat around a long table in a plain room and went through their debrief with a handler named Major Osi, who had been running special operations debriefs for 18 years and had the particular talent of listening to extraordinary things with an ordinary face. They talked through every decision and every moment and everything that had gone wrong and everything that could have gone worse. 3 of them had injuries that would need weeks to heal properly. One, Hollis, would need months. They drank terrible coffee from the same kind of cups they had always used and argued mildly about one tactical decision in the 3rd day's operation that 2 of them disagreed about. And Major Ose noted both perspectives carefully in his log without taking sides. When the debrief was complete, he slid a new mission folder across the table. Nobody asked where. Nobody asked how many. Every hand in the room reached for it. Outside, the fog moved across the mountain the way it always did, slow and quiet and completely indifferent to the extraordinary things happening beneath it. Inside, 12 people looked at the next mission, and none of their faces showed anything that looked like hesitation. Humanity rested for no one. Not because it was written in law or shouted as a motto or printed on the side of a warship in bold letters, but because the 12 people in that room, and the many thousands like them scattered across the dark and quiet places of the earth, had made a private and individual decision a long time ago, each of them alone, that they were not the kind of person who stopped. The galaxy was still learning what that meant. It would keep learning for a very long time.